Donald Trump called the Prime Minister of Canada a liar 5 times on camera at the White House in front of the international press. And the data Carney cited came directly from Trump's own government. So naturally, this ended very well for Donald Trump. It did not end well for Donald Trump. If you want coverage of the political stories that actually make sense of what's happening in North America right now, subscribe to the channel. Okay, let's get into this. Mark Carney walks into the White House. He's there to discuss trade, bilateral figures, the kind of meeting that usually produces a joint statement nobody reads and a handshake photo nobody frames. Normal diplomatic stuff. And then Trump, in front of cameras with the international press watching, calls him a liar. Once. Okay, heated moment. Twice. All right, escalating. 3 times. We're in territory now. 4 times. Somebody should probably say something. 5 times. 5 times the President of the United States looked at the Prime Minister of Canada and said on live television that he was fabricating trade data. 5. And here's the part where you need to pay attention, because this is where it stops being a diplomatic spat and starts being something genuinely bizarre. The numbers Carney cited did not come from Statistics Canada. They did not come from some Ottawa think tank or a friendly academic institution or a policy paper commissioned by the Liberal Party. The data Carney brought into that room came from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, the U.S. International Trade Commission, and the U.S. Department of Commerce, 3 American federal agencies, published within the last 90 days. Carney was reading American numbers back to an American president on American soil, and Trump called him a liar for it. So Trump called his own government's data a lie. Sure, you may have seen foreign leaders get dressed down at the White House before, but it's really something special when it's done using figures that the White House's own agencies published. Now here's what you would expect to happen next. Carney's team has a response ready. Of course they do. They're not walking into a room with the President of the United States without a response ready, and this response is detailed, sourced, 15 minutes long. Every figure traced back to its origin, every citation footnoted. A full forensic dismantling of the accusation laid out in such comprehensive and documented detail that no reasonable person could walk away with any questions remaining. A 15-minute airtight, fully prepared case for the defense. Carney looked at it and said no. Not no as in he didn't have time. Not no as in he forgot to read it on the flight over. No as in I am not using this. And reportedly the reasoning he gave to the people in that room was something like, if it takes 15 minutes to prove he's not a liar, he's already lost. Now that quote comes from unnamed sources described as being present, so treat it as plausible but not confirmed. But whether he said those exact words or not, what he did next made the argument more clearly than any quote ever could. He walked out in front of the press. He held up one piece of paper, one single page from those 3 American agencies. He gave them 30 seconds. 30. And in those 30 seconds, he laid out exactly 2 possible conclusions for the audience to choose between. Option 1, Donald Trump had not read his own government's published trade data. Option 2, Donald Trump had read it and called it a lie anyway, and then he said 5 words. The word he is looking for is mirror, and walked off. Oh. Now, within 3 hours of that clip going out, it was trending in 46 languages. 46. This is a trade data dispute between 2 North American governments. Not a declaration of war, not a nuclear standoff, not a world leader getting dramatically removed from power. Trade, data, trending, 46 languages. Because people around the world looked at what just happened and immediately understood it. A foreign leader got called a liar 5 times at the White House, walked back in, held up a single page from the White House's own agencies, and said, actually, look at this. That's not a press conference. That's controlled demolition. And just so everyone understands how this landed, let's talk about the polling. Within 5 days of the exchange, polling showed roughly 63% of Americans called Carney's response effective. About 57% said the fact that the data came from U.S. agencies specifically undermined Trump's accusation, and approximately 52% said they found Carney more credible than Trump overall. and that 52% included around 61% of independents and around 41% of Republicans. Quick but important note here, those polling figures were cited without a named polling firm, a specified methodology, or a published sample size. So treat them as directionally interesting, not as settled scientific fact, until someone provides the sourcing. But even without pinning down the exact numbers, the political picture they sketch is real enough to make any strategist deeply uncomfortable. A majority of Americans in at least one set of measurements found the Canadian Prime Minister more credible than their own president. Over trade data, not war, trade data, which means this rhetorical strategy has limits even inside the domestic coalition it was presumably designed to excite. Now let's talk about the White House press briefing that followed, because this is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable to watch. The press secretary gets asked a yes or no question, just yes or no. Does the president or does he not dispute the published data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the International Trade Commission, and the Department of Commerce? Yes or no? She could not answer it. She could not answer it. Think about why. Because there is genuinely no clean answer available. If the answer is yes, the president is saying 3 of his own federal statistical agencies got it wrong, which immediately opens the question of which other American agencies' data the administration considers unreliable and why anyone should trust any government data coming out of Washington. If the answer is no, the president just called a foreign head of government a liar 5 times for accurately reading American numbers, which means the liar in the room was not the Canadian Prime Minister. There is no door number 3. There is no third option. It's 1 or it's 2. And she stood at that podium and could not pick either one, because she understood, as everyone watching understood, that both options end badly. So she said nothing useful on camera. And the cameras, as cameras tend to do, just kept rolling. Meanwhile, the Allied reaction was starting to come in. France issued a formal rebuke. Germany followed. Japan put out a statement that analysts described as the strongest diplomatic language from Tokyo directed at Washington since the end of the Second World War. Now stop on that for a second. Japan does not reach for dramatic diplomatic language as a default. Japan's entire post-war foreign policy posture has been built on careful, measured, calibrated engagement with Washington. When analysts are putting Japan's response in those historical terms, that is a signal you take seriously, regardless of how you feel about the underlying trade dispute. And then there's this. 2 European foreign ministries reportedly contacted Ottawa after the exchange, not to discuss the trade substance, not to get Canada's position on the tariff dispute or the bilateral figures. They wanted briefings from Carney's communications team on the strategy, on how to respond to a public accusation from the specific White House with maximum credibility and minimum escalation. Other governments were essentially asking Ottawa, how did you do that? Teach us. Now, those reports come from unnamed sources, so flag them as unconfirmed. But if accurate, and there's no particular reason to doubt the general pattern even if the specific details aren't nailed down, the implication is something that should probably keep someone in the West Wing awake at night. America's allies are not just watching, they are studying. And what they are studying is not how to work with Washington. It's how to defend themselves in public when Washington comes after them. Want to know what Warren Buffett apparently had to say about all of this? He reportedly cited the exchange as proof that fewer words signal a stronger position. That framing is interesting and worth engaging with. If Buffett actually said it, it carries weight. But there is no named publication, no date, no direct quote with attribution. So treat that as unverified until someone puts a link in front of you. The underlying idea holds on its own without a celebrity endorsement. Brevity signals certainty. Certainty signals strength. 30 seconds of confidence reads stronger than 15 minutes of defense. Carney understood that intuitively. His 30-second choice was itself the argument. Because here's the thing about a 15-minute rebuttal. A long defense invites the audience to scrutinize your reasoning. It gives the impression that there is enough to argue with that you need time to untangle it. A 30-second response that holds up one page and offers 2 conclusions gives the audience nothing to pick apart. There is nothing to argue with. The page either says what it says or it doesn't. And it said what it said, so there was nothing left for anyone on the other side to grab onto, which is why the White House had no answer, and why it went viral in 46 languages, and why allied governments were calling Ottawa for the briefing notes. Now let's talk about what this actually means if you're watching from the United States. This is not just a diplomatic embarrassment story. The relationship between the United States and Canada is the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world, not the largest between North American neighbors, the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world. Supply chains cross that border in both directions for auto parts, agricultural products, energy, pharmaceuticals, lumber, steel, aluminum. Workers in Michigan, Ohio, Texas, California, and every other state that touches this supply chain in any way are directly connected to what happens diplomatically between Ottawa and Washington. And right now, what happened diplomatically between Ottawa and Washington is that the administration called the Canadian Prime Minister a liar for citing American data, could not defend that position when directly questioned, and watched the resulting clip trend in 46 languages while allied governments requested damage control briefings from the Canadian side. That is the baseline. That is what the trade negotiation is now happening on top of. If you're watching from Canada, the question is what Carney has established in the first significant public test of his tenure. He walked into a room where he was being publicly accused of lying, and he walked out of it with the credibility advantage, documented in American polling within 5 days. That has consequences for how subsequent negotiations are likely to go. And it has consequences for how Canada is perceived by other allies who are also navigating this particular moment in American foreign policy. Do you think direct pushback like Carney's is the right approach, or does that kind of public confrontation create more problems down the road than it solves? Because that's a genuinely interesting question and the answer is not obvious. Drop it in the comments. Now, here's the part that is genuinely not getting enough attention. There is a question sitting right underneath all of this that nobody in the administration has been willing to answer directly, and the evasion itself is its own kind of answer. What does it mean for the credibility of American statistical institutions when the president publicly accuses a foreign leader of fabricating data that those institutions published? The Bureau of Economic Analysis, the International Trade Commission, the Department of Commerce. These are not political appointee shops. They are career staff agencies. They produce the data that American businesses use to make investment decisions, that investors use to price assets, that researchers use to build economic models, that trading partners use to structure agreements. When the president implies that a foreign leader is lying by citing that data, there are only two possible claims being made. Either the foreign leader is misrepresenting the data, which is a factual question you can check, or the data itself is wrong, which is a claim with consequences that extend way beyond any single trade dispute. Carney's response made the first option impossible to sustain, which leaves the second, and nobody in the administration wants to go to the second option explicitly because opening that door means explaining which American government data is reliable and which isn't. And that is a door, once opened, that does not close cleanly. That's probably why the press secretary couldn't answer the yes or no question. Because yes and no both lead to the same place, and the White House doesn't want to go there. And here's where this story gets bigger than any single press moment. This is not the first time this administration has made factual assertions in public that its own agencies have already answered differently. That pattern exists. What is somewhat new here is a foreign leader responding to that pattern in a way that made the gap visible to a global audience in 30 seconds flat. And in doing so, potentially changed the calculation for every other allied government that has been trying to figure out how to handle a version of the same dynamic. Carney essentially demonstrated a method. You don't need a 15-minute rebuttal. You don't need a lengthy press statement. You don't need a panel of economists and a PowerPoint presentation and a bilateral summit on data methodology. You need the receipts. You hold them up. You offer two conclusions. You say your 5 words, and you walk off. And the reason it worked is because the receipts were the administration's own published documents. That's the part you cannot spin. You can argue with a foreign government's data. You can dispute a think tank's methodology. You can dismiss an opposition politician's figures. You cannot easily dismiss your own Bureau of Economic Analysis without creating a much larger problem than the one you were trying to solve. And the fact that 2 foreign ministries reportedly called to Ottawa for the briefing notes tells you that other governments noticed exactly this. They're not looking at Carney's 30 seconds as a great communications moment. They're looking at it as a template, a way to respond to public accusations from a particular kind of political actor that renders the accusation structurally unanswerable. Show them their own data. Offer 2 conclusions. Leave. The actor then has to either defend the data against themselves or admit the accusation was wrong. And neither of those options ends well for the accuser. That's not diplomacy as usual. That's a new playbook being written in real time. And it was written in 30 seconds at a White House press briefing by a former central banker who looked at a 15-minute rebuttal and said no. Did Trump forget that the Bureau of Economic Analysis exists? Or did he know and just assume nobody would notice? Because one of those options is a preparation failure and the other is something more deliberately problematic. And the White House press secretary still hasn't answered the question. The underlying trade dispute between the United States and Canada has not been resolved by any of this. Let's be clear about that. A viral press clip, however effective it was in that room and however broadly it traveled, does not settle a tariff negotiation. The actual policy questions about what trade framework the 2 countries are operating under, what the United States expects from Canada on issues like border management and fentanyl flows, what Canada is prepared to offer in exchange for stable market access, none of that has been answered. The 30 seconds was a pivot in a press dynamic, not a resolution of the structural issues underneath it. What it may have done, and this matters, is change the terrain on which those negotiations happen. If the strategy going into the meeting was to use public credibility attacks to soften Canada's negotiating position, to put Carney on the defensive before the real discussions began, that strategy just got considerably harder to execute because Carney demonstrated he has the receipts ready, that he's willing to use them, that he can deploy them in a way that lands in American polling within 5 days, and that the international community is watching and taking notes. That changes the leverage calculation. Not in a way that makes the trade dispute disappear, but in a way that makes the specific tactic of public accusation significantly less useful as a negotiating tool going forward. Because the next time it gets tried, everyone in that room is already going to be thinking about what happened last time. And so is the press. And so are the 46 language communities that shared the clip. Let's also name this clearly. The United States and Canada share not just a trade relationship, but a security relationship, an intelligence relationship, an energy relationship, and the world's longest undefended border. These 2 countries are not rivals who occasionally cooperate. They are structurally integrated in ways that took decades to build and that both countries depend on in ways that are not easily replaced. When the leader of one country calls the leader of the other a liar 5 times on camera, and cannot substantiate the claim, and watches the resulting clip trend in 46 languages, and sees allied governments call the other side for the briefing notes, that is not a moment that disappears from diplomatic memory. It gets filed. And it shapes how every conversation between these 2 governments gets framed going forward. Mark Carney walked into that room as a new prime minister in his first major test against a much louder, much more unpredictable counterpart. He walked out with 30 seconds, 1 page, and 5 words that the whole world is still talking about. Whether that translates into better trade outcomes for Canada is a question the negotiations will answer. Whether it changed the dynamics of how this particular relationship gets managed, that question has already been answered. And the White House press secretary is still looking for the right words. Maybe someone should hold up a single page and point her in the right direction. Thanks for watching. If this kind of coverage is useful to you, subscribe to the channel. No noise, no spin, just the story and what it actually means. Hit the notification bell so you catch the next one. I'll see you there.